The unexpected abduction. It was a peaceful afternoon when the world changed forever for Mark. He was sitting on the front porch of his small house, drinking his usual cup of coffee, watching the sun begin to set. The air was warm, and everything felt calm. His daughter, Emily, was inside, working on her homework. She was only 15, but already so smart and strong-willed. Mark couldn't be prouder of her. His wife had passed away a few years ago, and Emily was the only family he had left. He promised himself he would do anything to protect her, no matter what. Suddenly, something broke the silence. A loud, humming sound filled the air, followed by a strange, eerie light. Mark stood up, squinting toward the sky. At first, he thought it was a plane. But the light was too bright, and the sound too unnatural. It was something else. His heart started racing. He looked around, but the streets were empty, and the neighbors hadn't noticed anything odd. It felt like he was the only one who saw it. Before he could figure out what was happening, the humming sound grew louder. The light grew brighter, blinding him for a moment. Then, out of nowhere, the ground trembled beneath his feet. He staggered back, and before he could react, something large and metallic appeared in the sky. An enormous ship, like nothing he had ever seen before. It hovered above his house, casting a shadow over everything. It was so close that Mark could hear the strange sounds it made, like a deep rumble mixed with a high-pitched whine. "Emily!" Mark shouted, his voice filled with panic. He turned and ran into the house, his heart pounding. He found Emily in the living room, standing by the window, staring up at the strange ship. She didn't seem afraid, not yet anyway. Her face was full of curiosity, like she had never seen anything so interesting in her life. "Dad, what is that?" Emily asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know," Mark said, his voice shaky. "But we need to leave. Now." He grabbed her by the arm and tried to pull her toward the back door, but just as they reached it, there was a deafening roar from above. A beam of light shot down from the ship, blinding them both. Mark tried to shield his eyes, but it was no use. The beam was too powerful, too intense. Before he could do anything, Emily screamed. "Dad!" she cried, as if reaching for him. But it was too late. The beam of light hit Emily, and in an instant, she was lifted off the ground. Mark tried to hold on to her, but the force was too strong. He watched helplessly as she was pulled into the air, her body floating toward the ship above. Emily struggled, reaching out for her father, but the light pulled her away faster and faster. Mark's heart sank into his stomach as he realized that there was nothing he could do. His daughter was being taken. "No!" Mark screamed, reaching for her, but it was as if some invisible force was keeping him from moving. He felt powerless, like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The ship began to rise higher, and Emily was pulled into the dark abyss above. Mark fell to his knees, his heart heavy with fear and anger. He had never felt so helpless in his life. The beam of light disappeared, and the ship started to move, heading toward the horizon, vanishing into the distance. Mark was left standing in his yard, trembling. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Aliens? Was it possible? Everything seemed too unreal to be true, but there was no denying what he had seen. His daughter had been taken. Mark didn't know who or what had done this, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to sit around and wait for answers. Mark knew there was no time to waste. He had to find Emily, no matter what it took. He had always known he would protect her, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. He wasn't just her father. He wasn't just an ordinary man. And the aliens who took his daughter had no idea who they had just messed with. Mark's mind flashed back to his past, to the training he had undergone many years ago. It had been years since he used any of the skills he had been taught. He had been part of a secret program, a program that had turned him into something more than human, a super soldier. But he had left that life behind, thinking it was over. He had tried to forget the darkness, the violence, and the missions that had haunted him. But now, it was clear. The time for forgetting was over. He wasn't just a regular father. He was something much more dangerous. The aliens who had taken his daughter had no idea what they were about to face. "I'm coming for you, Emily," he whispered to himself, a fire igniting in his chest. "And nothing will stop me." As he stood there, looking up at the stars, Mark made a promise. He would do whatever it took to get his daughter back, no matter who or what he had to fight. The hunt had begun, and this time he would show the universe just how deadly he could be. Discovering the kidnappers. Mark stood in the middle of his living room, his eyes glued to the door. His hands trembled as he tried to steady his breath. Emily was gone, taken by the aliens, and the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. He had no idea who these beings were or where they had taken her, but one thing was clear. He would not stop until she was safe. His first thought was to call the authorities, but he knew that wouldn't help. This wasn't a typical kidnapping. There were no phone calls demanding money, no clues left behind, just a beam of light and a ship that vanished into the sky. The police wouldn't understand. They would think he was insane or, worse, just another man who had lost his mind. Mark couldn't afford to waste time explaining. He needed answers, and fast. He quickly grabbed his jacket and rushed to his car. He had to figure out where the aliens had gone and how he could get to them. There was only one place he knew he could start. The old files, a place where the secrets of his past were buried. It was a place he had tried to forget, but now it seemed like the only chance he had to save his daughter. As he drove toward the abandoned military facility, his mind raced. He couldn't help but think back to the days when he had been part of something far bigger than himself. Before Emily, before his quiet life, he had been part of a covert government program. A program that turned men like him into super soldiers. But that was a lifetime ago, and he had left that world behind. Yet, as he neared the facility, Mark knew he had no choice but to return. The aliens had no idea what they were dealing with. Mark wasn't just a regular man. He had been trained for situations like this, missions that required extreme skill, stealth, and strength. He had the abilities the world didn't know about, the abilities that had once made him one of the deadliest soldiers alive. The military base was as silent as Mark remembered it. Rusted gates, cracked concrete, and old, abandoned buildings. It felt like a ghost town. He parked his car near the main entrance, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, but he pushed the thought aside. There was no time to worry about that now. He had to find the answers. Mark made his way inside the facility. The door was locked, but that was never a problem for him. With a few swift moves, he picked the lock and slipped inside. The place smelled of dust and decay, a place frozen in time. He headed straight for the old computer room, the one place where he knew he could find the records of the program he had once been a part of. He sat down at the old terminal and began typing, his fingers moving quickly across the dusty keyboard. The screen flickered to life, showing a list of files he thought he'd never have to see again. He scanned through the documents, looking for anything that could explain what had just happened. He needed to know who the aliens were, why they were targeting Earth, and most importantly, why they had taken Emily. After several minutes of searching, Mark found a file labeled Project X, Extraterrestrial Threats. His heart skipped a beat. This was the information he had been looking for. His training had never included anything about aliens. He had been focused on combat, on secret operations, but he should have known there were more threats out there than just terrorists and rogue governments. The file opened, revealing a detailed report about alien sightings and encounters over the years. It described various species that had been discovered, some hostile, some peaceful, and some just as mysterious as the one that had taken Emily. The more Mark read, the clearer it became. The aliens were here for a reason. Earth was just one of many planets they had targeted in their search for something. What that something was, Mark didn't know yet, but he was starting to put the pieces together. As he scrolled through the documents, one name caught his attention: the Zithar Empire. According to the file, the Zithar were a brutal alien race with advanced technology, known for abducting humans for experiments and enslaving entire populations. They had attacked several planets, and now, it seemed, they had set their sights on Earth. Mark clenched his fists. This was no random encounter. The Zithar had chosen Earth for a reason, and they had taken Emily because they didn't know who she was, who her father was. They had no idea that Mark was not just an ordinary man. They thought they had taken an easy target, but they had no idea they had just made a terrible mistake. Mark sat back in the chair, his mind racing. The Zithar were ruthless, but they had underestimated him. They didn't know what he was capable of. And now he had a plan. He would track them down, one by one, until he found Emily. And when he did, he would make them regret ever coming to Earth. The file gave him one last piece of information: a location, a hidden Zithar base deep in the mountains. That's where they were holding his daughter. Mark stood up, determination in his eyes. The hunt was on. "I'm coming for you, Emily," he whispered to himself again. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but he didn't care. Nothing would stop him. The Zithar had made a deadly mistake, and now they would pay. Tracking the aliens. Mark's mind was sharp as he reviewed the information he had just uncovered. He could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, but he had no time to dwell on it. Emily was out there somewhere, in the hands of the Zithar Empire. And he wasn't going to waste another second. His instincts were kicking in, and he knew exactly what he needed to do next. The military facility's old records provided a location, an isolated base hidden deep within the mountains. It was where the Zithar had set up operations. From what Mark understood, this base was a center for experimentation and captivity, where they took humans for their sinister purposes. His daughter, Emily, was likely being held there, though Mark couldn't be sure exactly what the aliens intended to do with her. Mark's heart pounded with urgency as he loaded his gear into his car. The terrain ahead wouldn't be easy to navigate. He would need to be stealthy, quiet, and methodical. His super soldier training had never been more useful. He was fast, strong, and had the skills to get in and out of any situation. But the Zithar Empire was unlike anything he had faced before. They were ruthless, and this mission would not be simple. As he drove through the winding roads that led toward the mountains, Mark reflected on the strange feeling of knowing he wasn't just any man. The training, the enhancements, he had been designed for situations like this. The average person would have given up or panicked, but Mark had learned long ago to trust his abilities. He was ready for whatever came his way. The sun was setting as he neared the base's general location, and Mark slowed his car as he approached a small forest at the foot of the mountain. He parked the vehicle under the cover of trees, away from the main roads. From here, he would have to move on foot. The terrain was rough, but he knew how to navigate through difficult landscapes without being noticed. The Zithar Empire may have advanced technology, but Mark was prepared for their tricks. As he made his way through the dense trees, Mark moved with the quiet precision of a hunter. His breath steady, his mind focused on the task at hand. The mountains loomed ahead, and the feeling of urgency pushed him forward. He couldn't lose any time. His daughter was counting on him. After an hour of walking, Mark came to a clearing and crouched low, peeking through the brush. In the distance, he saw it, a massive metallic structure hidden beneath the trees, blending into the environment like a predator stalking its prey. This was it, the Zithar base. He studied the perimeter. There were guards, alien soldiers, at least 24, patrolling the area with high-tech weapons. The base itself was surrounded by an electrified fence, and Mark could hear the hum of energy coming from it. Getting past these defenses wouldn't be easy, but Mark had faced far worse before. His eyes narrowed as he studied the guards' patterns. They moved methodically, but there were weaknesses. The patrols were predictable. Mark had been trained to spot patterns and exploit them. There was a gap in the patrols near the east side of the base, a blind spot where he could slip past unnoticed. Mark made his move, taking slow, deliberate steps through the underbrush. He avoided the path where the guards were walking, slipping from shadow to shadow like a ghost. The Zithar soldiers didn't even know he was there. His movements were flawless, and he felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He was close, so close to getting to Emily. As he reached the east side of the base, he crouched down beside a large boulder, his eyes scanning the area. The guards were just a few meters away. Mark held his breath, waiting for the right moment. Then, as one of the soldiers turned his back, Mark darted forward, using the rock as cover. His heart raced in his chest, but he remained calm. His training kicked in, and he moved quickly and silently. Once past the first line of defense, he made his way to the perimeter fence. The electrified barrier was tough, but Mark wasn't worried. He had encountered similar obstacles before. With a few quick moves, he disabled the fence's power source. The hum of energy died, and the fence became useless. He was inside. The Zithar base was more massive than he had imagined, with towering structures and high-tech equipment. He could hear the sounds of alien machinery working, the eerie hum of foreign technology. It was clear the Zithar had been here for a long time, studying Earth and preparing for something much bigger. But right now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was finding Emily. Mark moved deeper into the base, using his superior skills to stay out of sight. The interior was a maze of hallways and rooms, each one filled with alien soldiers, prisoners, and strange devices Mark couldn't even begin to understand. But his focus was on one thing: Emily. As he crept down a narrow corridor, Mark spotted a door with a sign that read "Containment Level." His pulse quickened. This had to be where they were holding her. He didn't hesitate. Mark moved swiftly to the door, his hand on the handle. He paused for a second, listening for any sounds on the other side. He could hear voices, but they didn't sound like soldiers. They were speaking in a language Mark didn't recognize. His heart leaped. Was Emily in there? Without wasting another moment, he pushed the door open and slipped inside. The alien base. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he crept through the door and into the heart of the Zithar base. The room he entered was cold, sterile, and filled with strange, humming machinery. Alien technology covered the walls, wires hanging loosely from various devices. The air was thick with the smell of metal and something unfamiliar, almost pungent. But Mark barely noticed. His focus was sharp, his senses heightened as he moved deeper into the base. The voices he had heard on the other side of the door were louder now. They were speaking in an alien tongue, a deep, guttural language that was almost incomprehensible. Mark couldn't understand a word, but the tone was unmistakable. The aliens were conversing with each other, perhaps unaware of his presence, at least for now. He could feel the tension building. The further he went into the base, the more he realized how vast it was. The place seemed to stretch for miles, with dark corridors and rooms filled with unknown experiments. He pushed that thought aside. He had no time to waste. Emily was here somewhere. He would find her, and when he did, he would get her out, no matter the cost. As Mark moved through the hallways, he kept his body pressed to the walls, making himself as invisible as possible. He knew the Zithar would have security systems, but they hadn't anticipated someone like him. The guards he passed seemed distracted, their attention focused on their duties, unaware of the intruder silently slipping by them. Suddenly, he rounded a corner and froze. Ahead of him was a large glass window. Through the transparent wall, Mark could see what he had been hoping, no, praying, to find. A group of humans. They were locked in cages, clearly terrified, their eyes wide with fear, but one face stood out among the rest. Emily. Mark's breath caught in his throat. She was there, alive, though pale and frightened, her hands pressed against the bars of the cage. Her eyes were wide with confusion and fear as she looked around, unaware of her father's presence just a few feet away. Mark's heart soared and sank in the same breath. She was here, but she was trapped, held prisoner by the aliens. Mark's instincts took over. He had to be careful. He had no idea how many guards were around, or if the Zithar were monitoring this area. But one thing was certain. He couldn't risk a confrontation yet. His daughter was too close. He crouched low, making sure no one saw him. The room ahead was a central hub, where the prisoners were being held. It was guarded by 2 alien soldiers standing near a control panel, each one holding a weapon that looked far too deadly. Mark's mind raced. He needed to find a way to distract them, to get them away from the cages without alerting the entire base. Suddenly, an idea formed. The machinery in the room was vast, and some of it looked old, likely scavenged from previous expeditions to Earth. He spotted an old ventilation shaft in the corner of the room, just above the guards. If he could disable the system and cause a malfunction, the alarms would go off, and the guards would have to leave their post to investigate. It was a long shot, but it was the best chance he had. Mark moved quietly, careful not to make a sound as he approached the ventilation system. He quickly assessed the situation, noting the wiring and controls. With steady hands, he began to work, overriding the system and triggering a small power surge. Sparks flew from the console, and then, as expected, the entire room plunged into darkness. The alien guards cursed in their strange language, rushing toward the control panel. Mark didn't wait. He moved swiftly and silently, using the chaos to slip into the control room. He reached Emily's cage without a moment to spare. Emily's eyes locked with his the moment he entered. Her face lit up with recognition, but it was quickly replaced with a look of shock and disbelief. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark placed a finger to his lips, signaling for her to stay quiet. He quickly worked on the lock to her cage, his heart racing. The sound of the guards' voices grew louder, their footsteps approaching as they realized something was wrong. Mark had to hurry. With a final twist, the cage door opened. Emily's eyes widened as she stepped out, confused but trusting. Mark grabbed her hand, pulling her close. "We don't have much time," he whispered urgently. Just as he turned to lead her toward the exit, the lights flickered back on. The alarms began to blare, and the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. They were coming. Mark knew their escape would be far from easy. The guards were already regrouping, and the base was about to be on high alert. But he couldn't think about that now. He had one mission: get Emily out. Everything else could wait. They rushed down the hall, moving as quickly as possible without making a sound. Mark knew he couldn't fight his way out, not with so many alien soldiers on their tail. They had to stay one step ahead, using the chaos of the alarms to cover their tracks. As they neared the exit, Mark's mind raced. He had come this far, but the hard part was just beginning. The Zithar were relentless, and they wouldn't give up easily. But for the first time in hours, Mark allowed himself a small moment of hope. He had his daughter. They were together, and they had a chance. But before they could make it to freedom, Mark heard a voice from behind. It was the leader of the Zithar soldiers, a terrifying figure who had been monitoring the situation from the shadows. He stepped out into the hallway, blocking their path. "I knew it," the alien leader said, his voice cold and threatening. "You are no ordinary human." Mark's muscles tensed. This wasn't over yet. The fight for their lives was only just beginning. The ultimate test. The alien leader's towering figure stood in the dimly lit hallway, blocking the way to freedom. His cold, calculating eyes focused on Mark, and his cruel smile sent a chill down Mark's spine. It was clear from the way the Zithar held himself that he was no ordinary soldier. He was someone with authority, someone who had the power to stop them. Mark stood tall, refusing to show any fear. His grip tightened around Emily's hand, but he made sure she stayed behind him, out of the line of sight. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but he refused to let the pressure get to him. His super soldier training kicked in, and his mind began to calculate his next move. He was facing a Zithar leader, but Mark had faced impossible odds before, and he would not let this alien stand in the way of his daughter's safety. The Zithar leader sneered. "You think you can escape so easily?" His voice was like a low growl, filled with disdain. "You are not the first human to think they can defy us, and you will not be the last to fall." Mark's muscles tensed, ready to fight if necessary. But he wasn't stupid. He knew that fighting this alien would be dangerous, especially with Emily by his side. He needed a plan, a way to outsmart the Zithar leader and get them both to safety. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Mark said, his voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could see the alien's expression falter for a moment, the smallest crack in his otherwise confident demeanor. That was all Mark needed. He could use that moment of doubt to his advantage. The alien leader narrowed his eyes. "You are brave, but that will not save you." In that instant, Mark launched into action. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, one of the many tools he had carried for emergencies like this. It was a jammer designed to disable alien tech and disrupt communication systems. It wasn't perfect, but it would give them a fighting chance. He pressed the button on the device, and a low hum filled the air. The Zithar leader's expression shifted from surprise to frustration as his communication device shorted out. For a brief moment, the leader's connection with the rest of the base was severed. Mark used the opportunity to push Emily toward a nearby storage room, signaling for her to stay hidden. The alien leader hissed, his eyes flashing with anger. "You think you can escape with such tricks? You will regret this." Before Mark could react, the Zithar leader lunged at him, moving with terrifying speed. Mark ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding the alien's grasp. The force of the leader's attack caused the floor to crack beneath them, and the ground shook as if the entire base had been disturbed. Mark quickly regained his footing and darted toward Emily, but the alien wasn't done yet. The leader turned, his weapon glowing with energy, and aimed it directly at Mark. The weapon crackled with power, its energy crackling as it charged. In that split second, Mark had to make a decision. He could not dodge the attack. There was no way to outrun it, but he had been trained for this exact type of moment. The training he had received all those years ago kicked in, and in one swift motion, he activated his enhanced reflexes. Mark moved so quickly it was almost a blur. He dove in front of Emily, throwing himself in the path of the weapon just as the Zithar leader fired. The blast hit Mark head-on, sending him flying backward with a force that rattled his bones. He crashed into the wall, but his body's enhancements allowed him to withstand the blow. Still, the pain was enough to make him gasp for air. His vision blurred for a moment, but he forced himself to stay focused. He couldn't afford to collapse now, not when Emily was still in danger. Emily screamed his name, rushing to his side, but Mark held up a hand, signaling for her to stay back. He had to protect her. She couldn't get involved. The Zithar leader chuckled darkly. "You are stronger than I thought, human. But it doesn't matter. You will still fail." Mark gritted his teeth, pushing himself to his feet despite the pain. He couldn't afford to fail. Not now. Not ever. He locked eyes with the alien leader, and despite the burning pain in his body, he stood tall. "You're wrong," Mark said through gritted teeth. "You'll regret underestimating me." With a swift move, Mark launched himself forward, using the last of his strength to tackle the alien leader. The two collided in a flurry of punches, kicks, and weapons that clashed against one another. Mark's enhanced speed and strength allowed him to land several blows, but the Zithar leader was no slouch. He fought back with equal intensity, his alien form proving to be a formidable opponent. Emily watched in terror as the fight raged on, her heart racing. She wanted to help, but she knew her father was the only one who could win this fight. But just as the leader was about to land a devastating blow on Mark, something unexpected happened. The control panel in the distance sparked again, and the entire base shook violently. A loud alarm sounded, and the lights flickered before going completely dark. The Zithar leader paused, distracted by the malfunction. Mark seized the opportunity, using his enhanced strength to shove the leader back against a wall, knocking the wind out of him. The alien struggled to recover, but the damage was done. Mark had created an opening. "Run, Emily," Mark shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Now. Emily didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the exit, her heart racing, as she heard the Zithar leader growl in fury. Mark was right behind her, his body aching but determined to keep going. They were almost there, but as they neared the exit, a loud explosion rocked the base, sending shockwaves through the walls. Mark and Emily were thrown to the ground, the force of the blast knocking them both unconscious. Escaping the inferno. When Mark regained consciousness, his head was pounding, and his body felt like it had been hit by a freight train. The explosion had thrown him and Emily to the ground, and for a moment, everything had gone dark. He blinked, forcing his eyes to focus. The walls of the base were shaking, and smoke filled the air. The alarms blared louder than ever, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hallways. "Emily," he muttered, pushing himself up despite the pain. His heart raced as he searched the room, panic rising in his chest. Where was she? "Dad?" A small, scared voice called from the shadows. Mark's eyes immediately found Emily, crouched near a corner of the hallway. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear, but she was alive. Relief flooded through Mark, and he quickly staggered toward her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "I think so," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "But what's happening? Everything's falling apart." Mark didn't have time to explain. The Zithar base was crumbling around them, and they had no idea how much longer they had before the entire place collapsed. The explosion had caused a chain reaction, and the base was slowly falling apart. Fires raged in the walls, and debris rained down from above. "We need to move," Mark said, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her to her feet. "We don't have much time." The hallway ahead was filled with debris, but Mark's enhanced senses allowed him to spot a clear path. He led Emily through the narrow corridor, ducking under fallen beams and stepping over burning rubble. Every step they took was a gamble, but Mark knew they had no choice. The Zithar leader was still out there, and even though he had temporarily disabled him, the threat wasn't over. The entire base was about to become their grave unless they escaped. Fast. As they moved through the base, the ground shook again, and another explosion rocked the structure. Mark's ears rang, and he gritted his teeth, pushing himself forward despite the pain. The exits were close, but the alien soldiers were still patrolling the area, their footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Mark cursed under his breath. There was no way they were going to make it out if the soldiers were still guarding the escape routes. He needed a distraction, something big enough to draw the Zithar away from their path. They reached an intersection, and Mark spotted a large storage room off to the side. He pulled Emily into it, motioning for her to stay low. "Wait here," he whispered. Mark quickly scanned the room, his eyes landing on a stack of volatile crates. Explosives. He knew they could use them to create a diversion, but it was risky. If he triggered them too early, they would both be caught in the blast. But if he didn't, they might never get another chance to escape. With steady hands, Mark carefully placed the explosives near a group of alien equipment. He set the timer on a nearby device, his fingers working with practiced precision. Once it was set, he motioned for Emily to follow. "Stay close and stay low," he instructed, his voice urgent. "This will give us a chance to get out of here." They hurried out of the storage room, moving quickly through the hallways. Mark checked over his shoulder, counting the seconds in his head. The explosion would go off soon, hopefully before any of the Zithar noticed them. As they turned a corner, they saw two alien guards ahead, patrolling the area. Mark's heart skipped a beat. There was no time to fight them. They had to get past without being seen. Mark gestured for Emily to stay still. He moved quickly, his body blending into the shadows as he snuck up behind the guards. His enhanced reflexes allowed him to move silently, and before the guards could react, Mark knocked them both out with a swift strike to the neck. Emily gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, you just knocked them out like it was nothing." Mark didn't have time to explain. "Move," he urged, pulling her toward the exit. The Zithar were too close, and he knew they couldn't afford to stay any longer. The hallway ahead was clear, and Mark could see the main exit doors in the distance. The base was starting to collapse, and debris was falling from above. They were almost there, just a few more meters to freedom. But then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in front of them. The Zithar leader. Mark froze, his heart racing. The alien was standing in their way, his eyes glowing with fury. His body was bruised and battered from the earlier fight, but he was still alive, and he wasn't going to let them escape. "You think you can leave so easily?" the Zithar leader hissed, his voice full of venom. "You may have defeated my soldiers, but you will not leave this place alive." Mark's grip on Emily's hand tightened. He didn't have time to fight the Zithar leader. They had to get out of there, now. But there was nowhere to go. With the base crumbling around them, and the alien leader blocking their escape, Mark knew they were running out of options. He could feel the heat of the fire behind them, the walls closing in as the base continued to fall apart. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. In a flash, Mark pushed Emily behind him, shielding her with his body. "Stay back," he told her firmly. "This ends now." The Zithar leader smiled wickedly, raising his weapon toward them. Mark's instincts kicked in, and he lunged forward, using all his remaining strength to knock the leader off balance. The two tumbled to the ground, struggling for control. Meanwhile, the countdown on the explosives Mark had set earlier was reaching its final moments. He knew the blast was imminent, and it would either kill the alien leader or give them the opening they needed. The explosion came seconds later. The shockwave ripped through the base, throwing Mark and the Zithar leader apart. The entire hallway shook as the walls crumbled. Mark could hear the alien leader's growls fade into the distance as the explosion tore through the structure. Mark's ears were ringing, but he forced himself to stand, scanning the wreckage. Emily was safe, crouched behind a large piece of debris. The exit was clear now. "Come on, Emily," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "It's now or never." With one final push, they sprinted toward the exit, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The base was collapsing, but Mark didn't look back. He had his daughter, and that was all that mattered. As they burst through the exit doors and into the night, Mark felt the heat of the explosion behind them. The Zithar base was gone, reduced to rubble. They were free. But even as they ran toward safety, Mark knew this wasn't the end. The Zithar might be defeated for now, but there were always more enemies out there, and they would be ready. The road to redemption. Mark and Emily stood in the wreckage, their breaths heavy and labored from the escape. Behind them, the once formidable Zithar base now lay in ruins, the fires and smoke rising into the sky. The ground beneath their feet still trembled from the shockwave, but the sound of crumbling metal and collapsing walls was gradually fading into the distance. Mark's body ached, every muscle screaming from the fight, the explosions, and the intense physical strain. He had survived, but it had taken everything he had, and more. He looked down at Emily, who was still holding tightly to his hand. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but there was a look of quiet determination in her eyes. "We'd made it," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of their escape. Mark nodded, his throat tight with emotion. They had made it out alive, but they were far from safe. The Zithar weren't the only threat in the universe. Mark knew that better than anyone, and as long as they were hunted, there would be no peace for them. The enemy would keep coming. But for now, they were free, and that was something he would not take for granted. "We have a lot of ground to cover," Mark said, his voice firm as he began to lead Emily toward the forest ahead. It was the only cover they had left, and it would take them far from the destruction of the Zithar base. "But we're not done yet. There's still more we need to do." Emily raised an eyebrow. "More? What could possibly be worse than that?" Mark looked back at the burning ruins of the base. "You saw what they were doing there. The Zithar are part of something bigger, something we don't fully understand. We've only seen the tip of the iceberg. The real fight is ahead of us. And now, we have to be ready for it." Emily didn't argue. She knew her father was right. The Zithar had been ruthless, but they had also been just one faction in a larger war that was raging across the stars. Mark had always known there was more to their mission than just survival, and now Emily understood that too. It wasn't just about saving themselves anymore. It was about stopping an enemy that would keep coming until they were stopped. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of their footsteps, the only noise breaking the quiet of the forest. But despite the weight of their journey ahead, Emily couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. She had her father. They were alive. They had made it through the impossible, and together they could face whatever came next. As they moved further into the woods, the landscape around them began to change. The trees grew thicker, and the sky above started to darken with the promise of rain. Mark's mind was already racing ahead, planning their next steps, but Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. "Dad, do you think the Zithar are the only ones out there?" Mark stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. "No, they're not. The universe is full of threats, Emily. The Zithar were just one piece of a much larger puzzle." Emily's eyes widened with understanding. "So, what do we do now? How do we stop them?" Mark gave her a hard look, his jaw clenched. "We fight. We gather allies, we learn more about our enemies, and we prepare for the war that's coming." Emily looked up at him, her face set with determination. "I'm ready." Mark couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. His daughter had proven herself in ways he never expected. She had survived the Zithar's torture and their escape together. But more than that, she had proven she was ready for the challenges ahead. He smiled, though it was a small, weary smile. "We're in this together. No matter what happens, we fight. And we win." The rain started to fall, the first drops hitting the leaves above them, and soon soaking through their clothes, but neither of them cared. The storm in the skies matched the storm inside Mark's heart. The road ahead would be dangerous, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. With Emily by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. In the distance, the faint glow of a ship's lights broke through the storm. Mark squinted, his enhanced vision allowing him to spot the vessel even through the thick rain. It was a small ship, but it was enough. "Come on," Mark said, pulling Emily gently toward the ship. "We've got a long journey ahead of us." They headed toward the vessel, their path uncertain, but for the first time since the day the Zithar attacked, Mark felt a sense of purpose. They would face down whatever enemies awaited them. They would find allies, uncover the truth, and strike back against those who thought they could destroy them. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As they boarded the ship, Mark glanced back one last time at the wreckage of the Zithar base, now just a shadow in the rain. He had kept his promise. He had saved his daughter. And now, they were ready to take on the universe together.